Hello, fellow history buffs and taphophiles. I had the privilege of going to the Genesee Country Village Museum in Munford, New York, to explore their newest exhibit, Everybody's Going to Be There, the American Rural Cemetery Movement, and speak with their curator, Brandon, on how this exhibit came to life. Today, you're going to get the behind-the-scenes interview I did with Brandon and get a peek around the exhibit. I was actually at a volunteer fair with another organization I'm part of and was walking around the other tables and came across the GCVM table. Now, I'm familiar with them, I have been there before, but it was this rack card specifically that inspired me to go again. Now, if you follow me on Instagram, you might remember me sharing this post, and that is how I came into contact with Brandon, the curator. So can you explain to us the title of the exhibit and what made you land on that title?
Absolutely. So the title Everybody is going to be there. The American Rural Cemetery Movement refers to the fact that eventually we all have to confront that inevitable great mystery at the end of life, which is death, but also the fact that in 19th century America, cemeteries, specifically rural cemeteries, were a social center of a city on the outskirts of the city, albeit. These were living spaces filled with everyone alive or dead in your town and the living ecosystems that live in these green spaces of rural cemeteries. So I wanted to use that title as a way to really circle back to the origin and one of the main purposes of rural cemeteries as a space for living individuals to bereave in a respectful, manicured, green space that had a really a salubrious effect on one's health. Spending time in nature, we know, can greatly benefit your mental and your physical health. And 19th century Americans knew that when they were designing and creating rural cemeteries.
Now, we keep saying rural cemetery, but what does that actually mean? Now, before rural cemeteries, people were either buried on their family property or in small churchyards and graveyards. While we might use the terms graveyard and cemetery interchangeably today, they actually have two different meanings. The actual definition of graveyard is a burial ground often associated with smaller rural churches as distinct from a larger urban or public cemetery. And the cemetery is defined as an area set apart for containing graves, tombs, or funeral urns, especially one that is not a churchyard or graveyard. In 1750, the United States population was just over 1 million people. By 1800, it had risen to over 5 million. The rapid growth, mixed with the majority of people living in dense places like cities, led to rampant disease and rampant deaths. Traditional graveyards became cramped and filled very quickly. You also saw buildings being built up around these existing churchyards and small burial areas, so you really couldn't expand out any further. It also caused a vicious cycle of more disease, as these small, cramped burial areas were blamed for additional outbreaks of cholera and yellow fever.
So by the late 1820s into the 1830s, Americans are saying we have to do something about this, and they are removing burial spaces from the city and moving them into what was then the countryside. Now, many cities have grown up around rural cemeteries, and now they're in the city once again. But at that time, rural cemeteries were in the outskirts of town in natural settings, usually on plots of land that would have been difficult to develop into commercial or agricultural real estate. So here in upstate New York, we have a lot of land features carved out by glaciers, like drumlins, eskers, kettles. That would be very hard to level, to build a city upon,
Right.
or to uproot all of those trees and that were covered, those hills were covered in woods and forests. But they're perfect for rural cemeteries in the 1830s. They create beautiful layered vistas, so you can bereave in a quiet, respectable atmosphere, but also enjoy this beautiful natural setting.
The first example of the rural cemetery movement in the United States is Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Opened in 1831, it was designed with tranquility in mind and built well outside the city at the time. After Mount Auburn, dozens of similar cemeteries popped up, including Mount Hope Cemetery here in Rochester, New York, which opened in 1838. These spaces also naturally attracted people as places for recreation.
So when you see a rural cemetery out in the countryside or with that looks like a park, that is really the inspiration for the American parks movement. You would be forgiven to think that parks came first and then rural cemeteries modeled on parks, but it's actually the reverse. Um, Rural cemeteries inspired the parks movement.
Brandon, can you tell us what inspired you to do this exhibit?
Absolutely. So, really, I would say my parents inspired me from a very young age. My mom would take my sisters and I to picnic at cemeteries. We would, I don't do this any longer, but we would do grave rubbings of the stones back in the early 90s. And I was always enamored with the artwork, the stories of the people that were buried in cemeteries, and just the beautiful green spaces that these places reside in. I saw a lot of guests coming in, especially during our fall season, who were interested in mourning practices, death care. Why do cemeteries look the way they do? Why do modern cemeteries look, in their words, boring compared to really the high art architecture of 19th century cemeteries? So I really wanted to explore that, and I knew that there was a large group of people who were interested in that. So that's really the inspiration and the impetus of this exhibit here.
Speaking of mourning practices, this book, The Victorian Book of the Dead, is a very interesting read and captures some of the very interesting and unique mourning practices we did in the past, like hanging crepe fabric on a door after a loved one passed away. I also asked Brandon what the most interesting piece for him to curate for this exhibit was, and his answer falls into another unique mourning practice we used to do.
If I had to pick one object or group of objects in the exhibit that I love the most, I would say it's probably the memento mori in the exhibit, specifically the hair jewelry. You may view the hair jewelry and not know that you're actually looking at jewelry made of human hair, and you can be forgiven to think, oh, like that's a little skeevy, like I'm a little creeped out by that. But if you think about it, you're really taking a physical piece of that person that you're remembering, and you are creating an eternal object. You are putting it on your body, especially in the case of like brooches or necklaces, and putting it close to your heart. You are carrying that person figuratively and literally with you throughout the rest of your life. And I that reality of it takes the creepiness out of it.
We also spoke briefly on the Hollywoodism of cemeteries, that they're haunted or scary places, and to go along with that is the haunted tourism trend like ghost tours. Now, neither of us are against them. We think they are great to bring in people, but they only bring in people during a specific time of year.
And there are so many other avenues that cemeteries can explore to bring people back to the cemetery, take away and banish some of that macabre spookiness. And that is what one of the goals of this exhibit is, to banish some of that spookiness, that scariness, and have guests reconsider their relationship with their local cemeteries. How do I get involved? How do I preserve this for the future? Maybe this isn't a scary place, but really an open door museum, a reliquary of genealogy and high artwork set in stone.
The Genesee Country Village Museum is an immersive 19th century village, has over 5 miles of walking trails, a nature center, and the John L. Willey Gallery that is featuring Everybody's Going to Be There and 2 other exhibits. Everybody's Going to Be There is running now until December 2025, and they have built out an extensive programming schedule that may include a guest speaker that you might recognize. After our interview, I got another surprise and was taken to the back, to the vault, to see GCVM's vintage clothing collection that they use for multiple exhibits, and that was an additional super cool thing to do. I had such a blast visiting GCVM and speaking with Brandon, so thank you to the museum, Brandon for speaking with me, all the staff we interacted with while walking the 19th century village, and my guest videographers that helped me capture the day. And of course, thank you to you for watching and taking a little bit of time to learn more about cemeteries. For more information on the exhibit, visit gcv.org, and if you haven't yet, click that subscribe button to become part of the A.G.A family, and I will see you next time.